All right, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. So I introduced myself earlier. I'm Peter Smallidge. I'm from New York. I work at Cornell University, and I appreciate Mark and I had a chat about maple tree data in the summer, and I think this materialized from that. So it was a good chance for me to work through a lot of data that I had. Not quite as calmly as I wanted to. It never is. It's just like the deadline's looming. It's like, you know, get the computer code to work. Just a little background on me. I have a bachelor's degree in forest management from Purdue University, and then I did my graduate work in forest ecology at Syracuse. And that was mostly looking at forest response to different kinds of disturbances. So since then I've worked as extension forester doing applied research and extension, largely around either how to kill trees or how to grow trees. So I did herbicide work, flame weeding work, goats in the woods, crop tree release, tree plantings, those kinds of things. This was, well, I'll get to the kind of the background on this, but the background is this overall project on forest thinning has been going on for almost 20 years in a couple different fits and starts, and has had, I'll just say, a lot of people involved. And so this is not just me, certainly not just me, it's a lot of people that are part of this. Here's the punchline. So if you fall asleep, if you remember this, big trees produce more syrup. Mark showed that. I'll show it with our data. And then to the point, and maybe it begs, and it begs the question then, so big trees produce more syrup. Is it just because they're big trees? Or can we do things we know as foresters when we thin, we can grow trees faster, make bigger trees faster. So can we create those conditions that result in trees that have higher output? And so you see that list: tree growth, thinning increases tree growth, and then things like tree vigor and tree resilience are important when we wonder how our forests are going to respond to whatever stress is happening. You know, what's the stress of this year? Is it climate change? Is it drought? Is it ice storm? Is it something else? Just so we're all on the same page with thinning, thinning is an intermediate treatment, and we're trying to reduce competition for sunlight so that we can increase resources for the residual trees. From a maple perspective, we're thinking about tree growth, available wood for tapping. Mark talked a lot about that, vigor and resilience, and then ultimately the question, well, not ultimately, really the starting point for a lot of maple producers that I talk to is they start with syrup yield. Am I going to make more syrup? And then some of these other things are relevant. When I got thinking about doing research on sugar maple response to tree thinning, and all of this is about, I'll say maple, but it's all sugar maple. I haven't done anything with red maple. I was reading through the literature and looking at forest response and tree response, and recognizing that if we increase tree growth, we're going to produce more foliage, we're going to maintain better live crown ratio, increase the volume of sap producing wood, so that should be sap hyphen producing wood, so there's more wood to produce and carry sap. Trees will reach a tappable size sooner, more wood for future tapping. We talked about the percent of non-conductive wood. Some work out of Centre Acer up in Quebec, they found that you have larger xylem vessels, and that's associated with better sugar storage, increased differential pressure, so you're moving more sap, and then a better release of sugars. But none of it gets at what are the effects on sap and sugar and syrup. And the silvicultural guides that I had read were largely based on extrapolations from timber guides, or we went out and measured a bunch of trees in a cemetery and let's back calculate from this 30-inch diameter tree with 80% live crown to a 12-inch tree with 30% live crown. So I was interested in doing manipulative work on what happens when we manipulate the forest and look at those trees. I spent a lot of time, a couple of years, as I'm getting into maple, and so I started in '96 at Cornell, and then in about 2003 I started being more involved in the Cornell Maple Program, went on the maple tours, talked to maple producers, and I'd say, hey, do you do management in your sugar bush? And they said, oh yeah, yeah. And so I'm like, all right, done deal. Maybe I can go do something other than maple work. And I said, well, so when you say management, what's that involve? Oh, anytime a tree dies, we cut it down. And I'm thinking, all right, and then I'd look at their woods, and this would be kind of a not uncommon sugar bush, right? Fully stocked, no shortage of diseased and defective trees, poor formed. And so I thought, all right, we've got a lot of work to do. So my basic questions was, does thinning matter for sugar maple from a producer's perspective? How much should you thin? What's the intensity of release? And then how do we increase adoption over time? So we backed into it, how do we increase adoption over time? We started by saying, okay, we're going to do a citizen science project. This started in 2004. We visited a couple of dozen maple producers around New York and worked with them to put in 3, I think they were quarter-acre plots at each of 15 sites. We had a control, so 0 removed, 20% removal, and 40% removal. And that was of residual of basal area. Then we monitored that. Because we were working at kind of remote sites, it was difficult to measure volume, sap volume, and I just thought, in my mind, I thought, well, the trees are growing faster, they're producing more sugar. Anybody knows you're going to have higher sugar concentrations, right? It's like intuitive. So I'm baiting you into like what didn't happen. So we monitored sugar concentration, tree growth, and then just crown exposure. The short of that, all that work was that there's no effect. There's no change in sugar concentration, even when I thought it just should have been a slam dunk. It flatlined or decreased a little bit. And so that's a really hard story to increase adoption of forest thinning with a maple producer by telling them that sugar concentration declines. So that was a tough one. For whatever reason, then we started a follow-up to that where we looked at initially at one site. We replicated then again a second site at the Arnott Forest, which is in the Finger Lakes, replicated it with Adam up at the Lake Placid site. Same kinds of measurements, except we added in sap volume using the same canisters that Mark had showed. We calculate the syrup output, diameter growth, and we had a single measurement of crown size. So some of these attributes, we have the primary site where we started, it's called the lumber shed site. We've replicated that into the Decker site. The lumber shed's a little bit more mature. It's an older sugar bush, older trees, cut in 2018, cut in 2021. In both areas, we have at least 1 year of sap data before we did the thinning study. We had our fair share of stress events. We had droughts in 2020, in 2022, and then a spongy moth defoliation in 2022. And this is the basic configuration. We have each research tree has a research canister. We collect the sap in that canister. One side of the canister is connected to the vacuum. The other side of the canister is connected to the tree. After each sap run, we go out and we measure sugar concentration and volume. So we have pretty good data on individual trees. And each tree is categorized as upper or lower crown class and however many sides there were free to grow. So these were the variables, the kinds of things you would think about. So standard tree increments, maybe something a little different. I was interested in vigor, the efficiency of the tree to grow. And vigor, when a physiologist, and I have no background in tree physiology, which is a shortcoming for interpretations, but the vigor is, as I understand it, is interpreted as growth efficiency. So if you have a certain area, leaf area, how many square inches or square centimeters of leaf, and then how much does the tree grow per unit of leaf area? Well, that's, you can do the leaf area thing if you're a physiologist. If you're a forester, you measure diameter and convert it to basal area increment, And then that basal area increment is the R's relative basal area. So how's the baseline, current year basal area increment divided by a baseline? So it's a proportion of some baseline is my index of vigor. Pretty standard other variables. Down here, you have to synchronize the sap year with the growth year. So 2023 sap year is responding to the 2022 growth year. So I try to be careful. If I'm talking about tree growth, then it's the growth of that particular year. And if it's a sap year, then it's the growth in the preceding year. We've talked about variation. And there's a lot, individual trees, the genetics of individual trees, the history of those, the environmental impacts on that tree, spring temperatures, oscillations, droughts in the spring and the summer, soils. This is a picture. In this presentation, you'll see some stuff. It's like, oh, this is like low level. I'm a forester. I know this because I've adapted a landowner presentation for you all. So this is a picture I show, soggy ground. Here's Aaron Whiteman had a red maple study he was looking at. So when we thinned, we left red maple in some of this soggy ground and not very far apart, but enough change in elevation, a pretty decent producing sugar maple tree. So equipment is probably our biggest variant after weather. So vacuum pumps go down, something happens, that really hurts production, which really hurts then data. To give you an image of what we're dealing with, this is at the Decker site. We have average diameters in the lower crown class of 11 to 12 inches and about 15 inches in the upper crown classes. The sample sizes are complicating for the statistical analyses. Each of these setups is expensive to install and then expensive to maintain. It's like every time the sap runs, you're out there monitoring these. So relatively small sample sizes. The strength, if there is in the repeated measures. So the same tree is repeatedly measured year after year after year. At the Decker site, I did a 0, 2, and 3-sided release. At the original site, the lumber shed site, similar kinds of patterns. The lower crown class trees were a little bit smaller, 11 to 12 inches, and then 15 to 16 inches for the upper crown class. So when I laid this out, I had a nice distribution of where things were supposed to be. And then you send a logger in and they cut the trees, and sometimes your 2-sided release becomes a 3-sided release or something like that. So that's why these numbers don't match up, and I ended up merging together the 2- and 3-sided release. Wood production, this is just kind of background information. We're running, and I don't think in basal area increment, but this shows that we have a lot of variation in how fast the trees are growing, and no surprise, the upper crown class trees are always growing about 30 to 50% faster than the lower crown class trees. Syrup volume is about the same, much higher yields from the upper crown class trees, sometimes as much as 50% more yield, and a lot of variation from one year to the next. So these are just, when you think, I've been working with a statistician for the last month and a half, and she wrote this like really complicated statistical model, and my head was doing this kind of stuff, and there's nothing significant. So just a disclaimer, but it was probably a function of sample size and variability. So what you're going to see, you won't hear me use the word significant from here on out, but we'll look at patterns and then bounce that against what we understand as how trees work. And I've set this up so that there's just a series of statements that I make, and then I provide some data to amplify that. Thought I'd start off with the easy point. Increased sunlight makes trees grow faster. I focus on basal area increment. This is one of those landowner slides to illustrate to them that just because you get whatever this is, 4/10 of an inch growth in diameter doesn't mean two different sized trees are growing the same amount of wood. There's in fact, about almost a 50% increase increment of wood, and so that's an output that the tree has to cover. This is looking at how trees responded to the thinning. So this is post-harvest average basal area increment, and the pattern on these graphs is all going to be pretty much the same. The Decker site, if I include it, is on the left-hand side. The lumber shed is on the right-hand side. Upper crown class, lower crown class, upper crown class, and lower crown class. And what this is showing is well, not always, but if you give trees more sunlight, you get more growth, but it doesn't necessarily correspond in a linear fashion to more sunlight equals more growth, although sometimes it does. So remember, this is 2 growing seasons post-thinning. This is 5 growing seasons post-thinning, the averages. The lower crown class has a similar or more predictable response. Increased sunlight results in increased growth. We talked about there's a conversation about when you all as managers are forecasting how much growth you're going to get as a result of thinning, can you monetize that? So this would, I think, help address that. I converted number of sides free to grow. I went out, stood in the woods, looked up and said, of the 360-degree perimeter, what percentage is open for growth? And that's reported on the x-axis. And then we look at the growth rate of the tree. In the lumber shed area, we have predictive equations here that allow us to say these upper crown class trees, their response to sunlight is about the same as a percent of openness as the lower crown class trees. So they're both responding about the same, but at a faster rate in the upper canopy. At the Decker Road site, the upper crown class trees are just flatlined. There's no apparent response to an increase in sunlight after these first couple of growing seasons. The lower crown class trees have that. So this I think could add to that conversation of if you're thinning and you're investing in forest management and you're going to do some amount of release, what might you expect as growth response? And then I'll show some basal area increment against sap volume increment later. So thin your woods, trees grow bigger. Forestry's shown that now over the last 120 years, so nothing striking there. Bigger trees produce more syrup. This is similar to the graph that Mark showed. And I was quickly looking at your chart and saying, where do your numbers match up with what I have? And they're very similar. So you had, I think, an 18-inch tree was pretty close to an inch of syrup volume. So I'm just below that. And I took this equation, and for each inch of diameter increase, we're calculating a 6% increase in syrup yield. So whatever it takes as a forester on your site and with your trees to grow them another inch, this would say you're going to increase syrup yield by 6%. And just like Mark said, this is one location, right, for within a certain window of time. So every other site and soil and stand history is going to be a different image. But you and I think Tim had looked at some DBH data, syrup data from a couple of different locations, and there was a strikingly high level of similarity between those 3 sites.
But also a high degree of variability.
And a high, yeah, right. Yeah, so this is like, all right, so we have, this tree, and we also have got, it's just trying to, there are days I get up, I think I'd really wish I'd worked in Petri dishes, and then or better yet, engineering, concrete, the variability of concrete. This is another landowner slide, but it plays well with the conversation that we had. You have a 12-inch diameter tree. There are 37 1-inch columns. So if you have a 1-inch spacing between your spiles, which we don't, we're running more like 2 inches or 2.5 inches between spiles, and you tap to 1.5 inches depth, you're going to need 3 inches of diameter growth every 4 decades if you're tapping at a single band so that you can stay out of that non-conductive wood. When you double this to 2 inches, then you have that roughly. So, I mean, you from these numbers, 12-inch tree, 1.5 inch depth, 1 inch of spacing, your trees need to be growing about 1/10 of an inch in diameter per year to hit that target. So I think of these as tapping assumptions or tapping the criteria to meet tapping expectations. I have a memory that Vermont had a chart or a graphic that would show the expected growth rate for a tree of given diameter. So a larger diameter tree, you've got further to go around that tree before you come back to where you started. So that's not a fixed, that 1/10 of an inch diameter growth is not a fixed number. And then I wondered, how fast are my trees growing? I'd never calculated that. And I get in arguments, but Aaron Whiteman manages the maple woods at the Arnott Forest, and his predecessor liked to double tap the trees. I'm like, Steve, those trees aren't growing fast enough. Oh, but look at all the sap we're getting. It's like, they're not growing fast enough. So it's this, back and forth. And I thought, well, I'm gonna go stand in front of a bunch of foresters, and one of them's gonna say, well, how fast are your trees growing? So I thought, I'm gonna have to finally calculate that. So the trees are growing. This is in the lumber shed area. The upper crown class trees with 4 sides release are growing on average 0.15 inches of diameter per year. Our 4-sided release or 0 sides release are at about 0.7, except if you're the lower crown class, you're essentially not growing. These lower, I have a bias against lower crown class trees. It's, and I shouldn't, because when you look at the data, they're producing maybe 1/3 of the syrup volume in a woods. So I can't be too hard on them, but I still just, they have their limitations. So bigger trees produce more sap, and as trees grow faster, they increase their vigor. The vigor is then associated with resilience. So how well can that tree respond to some kind of a stress event? If it's a drought, which is the only data that I have, ice storms, things like that. So percent crown openness on the x-axis, vigor, which is measured as relative basal area, and you can see this line. So we have this positive relationship that shows as you give a tree more sunlight, and we just showed if you give a tree more sunlight, it's growing faster in an absolute and relative sense. So more sunlight equates with an increase in vigor. What's that mean for resilience in a real sense? This is my index of vigor at one location, and this is just the upper crown trees in the lumber shed area. This was the growing season before thinning happened. So this is growing season in 2018. It was thinned in the fall of 2018. 2019, growth response. So some of this was environment, some of this was thinning response. The lower crown class trees essentially didn't respond. They didn't have any growth increment to speak of in 2018. And then we had a drought in 2020, so all of the growth subsided. The 0 sides free to grow disappeared. And the ability to grow was associated with the amount of sunlight that was provided. So this is like not take it to the bank and get a loan against it, but it's some indication that as we give trees more sunlight, they have better growth rates, and their ability to respond to these stress events is improved. It'll be interesting to see, so the 2023 data I haven't collected yet. 2022, another drought in the growing season. Similar pattern, except here, and this is wild speculation, that the gypsy moth defoliation was more intense on the upper crown, these trees that had full, so these are all upper crown class trees, but these trees that had higher levels of crown release suffered more under the gypsy moth, the spongy moth. So either they had greater defoliation, or they were trying to grow more or leafed out more aggressively, something like that. So increased growth increases tree vigor. How does tree growth and sap sugar respond? Same as what we found 20 years ago. You grow a tree faster, basal area increment increases, and your sugar concentration drops down. So loss of sugar, which the trees are still producing the sugar, but I think they're using it in ways other than to give it to maple producers. So they're making, and there's some literature that talks about how trees allocate carbon, and the early allocations is, the first allocations are to roots and foliage, and then there's about 6 or 7 categories of how trees allocate that carbon. Making it available to maple producers isn't one of them just because they're growing faster. So this is the nuanced part of the story when you're presenting to maple producers is, yeah, you should really thin your trees, and oh, by the wood, you're going to lose sugar concentration. It's going to decline. Yeah. Well, that's my last question. You're still my last point on my last slide. So this is basal area increment. Same thing happens here. More sunlight, no change in sugar concentration. How about with sap? The positive relationship with sap. So you increase the amount of wood, you increase the amount of sap that's available. Basal area increment, so we showed more sunlight equals greater increments. Greater increments are associated with an increase in the amount of sap volume. The red dots, I should have said, are lower crown class. The blue dots are upper crown class. But again, look at the magnitude of variability that you have here. So trying to use this as a predictive equation is a challenge. But we could go back to percent openness and that relationship to basal area increment and then say, okay, we can show some pattern of percent openness and sap volume. So when you're trying to monetize your investments in forest management, what might you expect in terms of sap yield? I have not done those calculations. So sugar goes down, sap goes up. The real question is, what's the net benefit from a syrup perspective? And thankfully, it's positive. So you grow your trees faster, they produce more syrup. The increased volume of sap, and I had never thought about this until today, was with reverse osmosis, that maybe is less of an issue. So the sugar concentration isn't as high, we have more sap volume, but we can process that efficiently with reverse osmosis. The question, though, is, so if we want to take this and make it happen in the woods, how intensely should we harvest? In some of the earlier slides, and I should have recycled one of those slides, some of the earlier slides showed that you get this stair-stepping when you go from a 0-sided release to a 1-sided to a 2 and 3 in terms of growth, but in terms of syrup volume, in the upper canopy, it seems like you get most of your gain when you go from a 0-side release to a 1-sided release. Now, if you're also worried about tree growth and adding wood, the 1-sided release is not the same as a 2-sided release. So my interpretation of this is that we want to be somewhere in that probably more than 1, but less than 4. And there's not a lot. Some of the other data that I've analyzed with the statistician shows there's actually a bit of a drop-off when you get into some of those 4-sided release. And in the early study, I did a 4-sided release on some 18 and 20-inch sugar maple and killed them. So that's a disheartening, start to your morning. It's like, ooh. So I'm in the 1 to 3 camp in terms of how many sides to release in the upper canopy, and it doesn't look like there's much. So this looks like a negative trend. I'm telling you this is a positive trend we should pay attention to, and I'm saying don't pay any attention to this negative trend. So you decide how to interpret that, but it doesn't look like there's much going on in the lower canopy. This was lumber shed. The other location is about the same. There are no 4-sided release over here, but again, we get that step up from 0-sided release to the to the kind of the middle categories, 2s and 3-sided release. So the conclusions I draw, again, bigger trees are going to produce more sap, and that we can influence that, and what we've done and know as foresters can have an impact on that. I'm saying at least a 1-sided or better release, and you'll increase growth, syrup volume, sap volume, vigor, resilience, and we wonder how long does that depression in sap sugar concentration happen? As those canopies expand, trees will, I assume, and this is where I need more tree physiology knowledge. At some point, those trees are going to kind of reach their mechanical limits of how far are they going to expand. They're building this investment in architecture, but if that subsides, at what point does it subside? And then what do they do with that extra sugar? They've got all that extra branching to grow foliage. Then are they going to release that? The old-time maple producers that ran buckets would always say, it's the big crown trees that have the sweetest sap. I didn't see that. In fact, I saw the opposite, but at some point that may come back around. The other message for maple producers, and I make them all stand up and say, it's okay to cut a maple tree. So, we have time, I think, for questions, maybe, a little bit, or we can just walk and talk in the woods as well. And I'd really like your reactions to what you're seeing, and if this jives with what you've experienced and observed in the woods where you've been working. So,
I'll say, from experience here, in areas that we maybe marked a little more aggressively around crop trees, we did see some wind throw. It definitely gives you pause for future. So, the difference of releasing all 4 sides versus maybe 1 or 2 sides, trying to sync it up maybe with another schedule for replacing tubing or something, rather than, what I tend to say to maple producers is, a little is good, a lot is not necessarily better.
right.
You're not, the real risk of trees that aren't well supported, wind throw, that sort of thing, is there.
So the trees that I killed were not by wind throw, they just standing dead.
There was sun in the prime roots?
I don't know.
I don't know. No, there's no obvious, these were, like, put this image of the most beautiful maple tree in your mind, and that's what I killed.
Way to go.
I know it. The name of research.
I thought you told me that we weren't supposed to release maples on more than 2 sides, because it stresses them out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
1 or 2 sides, that's what we recommend.
So do we know, like, when you're talking about it's okay to cut a maple tree, on a stand level, do we know at what point, is it okay to cut a maple tree because at a certain point the sap volume or sugar volume eclipses what is lost by losing that tap, or because of the benefits to vigor and resilience, the ability of those trees to remain vigorous amidst other stressors and stuff like that?
So I think it's both of those. So there's some of those trees that are, they're just not producing. I could flip back and show you those graphs of the 0-sided release lower crown class trees. Their growth rate is almost non-existent, and their output is really low. In the early study, so we had that, I referred to it as the citizen science, we replicated that at the Yarmouth course, and I had several plots there, and I was tapping 4-inch diameter trees, and by the 3rd year I could not find clean wood to tap into. A 4-inch tree is not very big, but the partitioning that was created, and so I just stopped tapping them. So that proportionality of the volume of non-conductive wood in a 12-inch diameter tree is still going to be much higher than in these larger diameters. And if they're not growing fast, they're not adding enough wood that you're going to meet those tapping guideline assumptions. So in my view, those are easy trees to pick, especially if by cutting one of those, you're going to release a tree that has better attributes. It's more of an upper crown class tree. It has a nice crown, those kinds of things. So,
And I'm just trying to in my mentally parse because there's a lot of information there.
yeah.
I was wondering if Did you break out red maple versus sugar maple?
I did not do anything with red maple.
It's all sugar
It's
maple.
all sugar maple.
Because I bet you that, I wonder, like if you had done red maple, I'll bet you wouldn't have seen nearly the increase in those lower crown class trees when you released them.
Oh,
When, you know, because like sugar maple can release from the understory
right,
and like recover and
right.
keep going, and I feel like a lot of other species can't do that.
Yeah, it would have been, and that, I'm guessing, you know, the work that's been done here at Proctor, and I don't know if Adam's done any work with red maple. We've done a little bit of like just simple, like pilot scale monitoring. I could see that leading into, you know, a similar kind of red maple response to forest management questions. Well, we just, if I, you know, if I had done it, then I'd take my tiny sample sizes and cut them in half, and then I'd really have nothing to look at.
It's interesting, so much of what we think about with this stuff depends on our sites and you know, where we're practicing, you know, and you just said you can, you know, take a lower crown maple and release it. You know, I was thinking, I was actually formulating a question about whether or not your lower crown maples, were they suppressed trees or were they
Younger trees.
young, were they a second age class or were they
I don't.
simply intermediate,
So
same age?
I haven't cored any of them. My sense is that they're the same age class.
Right.
There's some work we did, and he was the lead on it, looking at, we cored, it was 18 sites, I mean, it was a total of, I think, 1,400 cores, sugar maples tapped with high vacuum, and absolutely the suppressed trees had the lowest growth rates, and it was really, we assumed, although we didn't go to the center, but it was basically the same age class. Yeah.
So they were even age trees, but it was just,
Just didn't win the race.
Yep. So what do you think about this was like an idea that was developing when Mark and somebody was talking about, you were maybe mentioning, you know, can you, it was the study of the foresters, and the question is, do you forecast or do you have expectations for forest management based on the forest management that you do? So if we can say that here's how trees respond to an increase in sunlight in terms of basal area increment, and here's how sap volume responds to an increase in tree growth. Could you, I mean, what would that be useful from a forest management perspective to be able to say, all right, we have this stand, it has this level of stocking, and this isn't stocking types of data, but we're gonna do some kind of a release, and we can expect this kind of we'll forecast this kind of a basal area increment response to that. Could you go the next step and say, here's what I think maybe is gonna happen in terms of syrup volume? I mean, is that the kind of information that you would need, or is there other information that you would want? It doesn't include saying that we're going to guarantee what the weather's going to be like.
I feel like, for me personally, like I feel like a lot of us probably know that there's benefit to doing this work, the thinning work, and not just for tree vigor, but also for other stuff that we want to manage for, like structural diversity, habitat diversity, bird habitat, tons of other stuff. But I think what would be valuable for me of having that information would be being able to convey that to sugar makers in terms that's like impactful for them. To make that argument, because they might be like, we're just thinking about number of taps, syrup volume, sugar volume, and so to be able to like make a compelling argument to them on their own terms, sort of, would be what I'd be interested in.
Do they, I mean, what compels a maple producer to go past number of taps? Because I haven't met that maple producer yet.
Well, if you were like,
I mean, I've intuitively known the difference, but I've fallen into that same, you know, how many taps do you have kind of conversation, which is, you know, that's been one of the key messages here. It's not about the number of taps, it's about the quality of the taps that are involved in your operation. So I mean, between what Mark has and what we have, we could, I think, put together a pretty handy little fact sheet that says, you know, here's some things, other ways to think about what's going on in your woods, but I'm not,
I think most of the sugar makers up in, perhaps statewide, you know, are thinking about pounds per tap. So they're not looking at, you know, judging, you know, their production on their numbers of taps, but, you know, what is their actual production per tap?
okay.
It'd also be interesting to understand labor. You know, you got an acre with 100 taps versus an acre with 60 taps. It's the difference in labor that you have in tapping, untapping, leak checking.
Yep.
Because that was one of the highest costs to Mark's pie charts there.
Time in the woods, yeah.
Has anyone ever, like, for an intermediate treatment like this, has anyone ever also, you know, calculated everything in terms of revenue, and then included the timber outputs as a portion of that revenue? Like, this is how much money you're making. You go do an intermediate thinning, you're losing X amount of taps, but maybe you're gaining back some amount of sap volume over time, and you also have this output, which is small diameter saw logs, firewood, other stuff.
I've not seen that. That'd be
Well, that was something we talked about with, what's his name, up in Auburn, Maine, is a Steve,
Ethan, are you talking about generating income from what's removed during those intermediate treatments? Or
Correct.
comparing it to harvesting for other?
Well, I guess we're just talking about it in terms of like,
Like an economic
Sap
life cycle
production.
Yeah,
analysis.
that was a
But
conversation.
the timber outputs aren't
I'm
necessary.
getting caught up, there's an individual up in Auburn, Maine, and we had this conversation when we started that 2018 project, was given what we've got, so I think the answer is not yet, but the
Yeah.
question is like, we've got financial records on a number of maple producers, small sample again, but we sort of have some profiles to work from. And then we had the startup investments that I showed earlier, and the question was, could we get forest professionals to contribute to say, if we know that mainline tubing systems are probably coming down or will be theoretically obsolete in 15 years, what's the full net present value kind of equation for new acquisition, pre-thinning, tubing setup, 15 years of maple operation with annualized revenue, taking the tubing down, doing some sort of forestry activity which potentially could yield, whether, I don't know if it's saw log and or firewood or one or the other, and then bundle that up and say, what's the 20-year model look like from an economic perspective? Because that's probably, you guys tell me. The idea was that's the turnover of the maple technology in the woods and possibly the turnover of the forest management plan that would allow you to sort of to create a 20-year horizon, something like that. I don't think it's been done. The question is it worth anything to try it? Like, do woodland owner investors want to think like that?
I'm seeing a lot of my neck of the woods, a lot of the bigger operations starting to bury all their main lines. What's the driver of that? Is that longevity? Is that access for forest management? Do you have
I think access is a big one.
It is.
Yeah, access and freezing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You have freezing.
Yeah.
Assuming it's done well, which there's plenty of examples of it not being
Yeah.
done now. Not only do you have the freezing, but you also have syrup quality issues.
Right.
Sap pooling in there and vacuum transfer not being ideal if it's not on grade.
I'm gonna plan to bury some of mine this summer, and it's just so it doesn't. I don't have to worry about trees falling on it. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
That's a big one too.
There you go.
Upkeep.
Upkeep.
Yeah.
I'm curious the cost difference between.
Well, is there enough dirt in Vermont to bury?
Hey, now.
I think on some of the ridge tops in New York, it's like you got this much dirt, and the farmers say, that doesn't work
You don't got
well.
good dirt over there.
I would comment back to Peter, your original question, and I'm trying to channel a little bit of Chris when we get into this idea of this forest assessment. The way you framed the question was, what are sugar makers thinking? And I think one of the other questions is, what is a prospective maple operator that's not actively sugaring? What's their opportunity to maybe look at two different possible parcels So this maybe sort of does a little bit of having to pre-think what the thinning plan would be, but could a forester go on site and make that assessment of is like, is it 100 small taps or is it 50 appropriately sized trees? But to be able to get again to that kind of sugar per acre or sugar per parcel assessment. So it's less of what can I do to make this better, but it's can I look at one option here and one option there, and can I make an informed evaluation on which site has better productivity potential straight out? Like, is this site ever going to reach this productivity over here? Or is this one just better suited?
As a starting point, it seems like you could calculate the yield per tap and then the cost per tap and do a, cost efficiency calculation that would point you in one direction or the other.
How would you calculate a yield per tap without having tapped it?
It would have to be.
I think that's where we need that sort of force
Yeah, it's just a
stand
diameter
conversation.
Okay.
You'd be making a.
There's a tool.
Model or something?
We have a
Yeah, I think it's going on.
in process.
I see.
Yeah, it's been problematic.
Is this back to the SAP calculator kind
Yeah,
of
we've
thing?
been trying to work with basic inventory data, so basal area, tappable trees, and tying it to what limited data we have in terms of sap yield. We've used this property as an example. Like getting it over the hump to make it something that's actually usable for foresters is a little challenging. It's going to be coarse no matter what. Like no one's going to go on record and say, oh yeah, plug in what your inventory says and you're going to get this. So, because of all the caveats.
Can you run scenarios? Can you run like a, not a tree person, can you run a big tree scenario, a few big trees and a lot of little tree scenarios, and do you see any differences, or is it not even to that point where you can, is that not a possible question to ask?
We've done a couple of different distributions, so Tony's been involved. Yeah.
To what degree would site index affect that, like in terms?
Well, based on all this talk of non-conductive wood accumulation and growth rate, in the short term, probably not as much if it hasn't had a history of tapping. It's what's your horizon? What are you looking at long term?
Okay.
So if trees aren't really growing well because it's on a poor site, then those things are gonna catch up to you eventually.
Yeah.
In the short term, I was only able to share 10 years of data on a site that's not poor, but it's certainly not lush. It's not a super duper sugar maple site where we had our long term.
Okay.
Multi-decades, I would say, if people are doing even a marginally careful job with tapping, you're probably not going to see anything on different sites. That's my opinion.
I think it goes back to his finding on the resilience. It's the long-term benefit of that. In the short term, that thinning might have actually reduced potential stand-wide yield, but by having those high bigger trees, the average is going to be greater in that thin stand over time. And so that's a hard message that, oh yeah, you're limiting the variability over time by thinning, because in the near term, Mark, it would probably not look great if you're looking at this number of tappable trees and yield from that density. So
I don't know about the yield part, because I mean, it's like for any other forest output, when you thin, that first entry is a pretty easy decision-making process. And when we did the early part of the study, and we had those 15 cooperators, we tagged all the trees, entered all the data in, and then we sent the landowner out with flagging, and they flagged the trees, and we had deduct their size to get to those thresholds. They picked the same identical trees that we would have picked. And it's I'll say the ugly trees, right? Poor crowns, poor formed, disease, insect, sugar maple borer damage, those kinds of things. And when we had cut them down, the growth increment on those trees, so we did the cutting then, the growth increment on those trees was minuscule. So I don't think, and then the lumber shed, when we cut that, Aaron didn't feel like we had really lost that much yield. So it's complicated because we improved the tubing system after the logging operation. That was an area that we'd started with close to the road, tapped a few trees. A few years later, over 30 years, it's like you keep expanding the tubing system, and it starts off poor, and then it just is bigger and poorer. So, and then after you log it, then it's all nice and pretty, and it's laid out, and everything flows downhill and kind of stuff. So that's confounded, but the perception was that we didn't lose yield as a result of that. I mean, we didn't pick trees, and that's another caveat I should put on these data, is that those were not randomly selected trees. Some of them were, here's a tree and it's next to an ash tree that's loaded with emerald ash borer. We know that this tree is going to be released, and so therefore we'll just add it into one of those. It's not going to be a control tree. We can't do that with them. So.
When we thin trees, do we lower attrition in the stand in the future? Like, are we
Yeah,
supplanting mortality?
Yeah, oh yeah.
Because we're still going to have some, but just
Yeah,
it's going to be reduced.
yep.
And obviously with ash, greatly reduced.
But
potentially.
so the issue, I like that first picture you showed, is that those trees that will die, ultimately you can tap until they die. You know, so it's different than looking at it from
Yeah.
like a wood product standpoint, where you're going to get that pulp yield or you know, that's
Yeah.
that's a different element of it. So
I guess I just keep on thinking about it as just like me making an argument that's going to allow us to do good forest management that increases resilience and vigor and all these other things to people who don't necessarily care that much about those things.
yeah,
And so making an argument of like, you're putting up this investment in these sap lines, you're lowering attrition in your residual stand, so you're lowering the cost of you then cleaning up your lines over time.
That's probably, I mean,
Natural
I
mortality.
think
Probably
you
a
have
good
to
case.
argue, I think you have to argue it from their perspective, right?
Yeah, you got
Because
it.
those, this tree, in fact, I think this tree, specific tree, did fall on a main line.
Yeah.
And there's no surprise to that. And it doesn't fall on it in the summertime. It falls at a peak run.
Yeah.
Um,
Because I think even some of this other stuff, like them, them growing trees fast enough so that they don't lose all their conductive wood, is a pretty abstract concept over that amount of time. For a lot of folks.
The first picture I showed was the maple producer. He said, I'm 67. What am I going to get out of this? I've got another 5 years.
Yeah.
And as an extension educator, I have to be where he is. It's like, all right, you want my opinion? It's hard for me to compel you to take out at 67, take out all your tubing, thin it, and then put it all back up for another, whatever he was thinking, another 5 years of tapping. So.
Yeah.
And he didn't do it. But his son took it over. I think his son actually did it. So.
And that's interesting, that's what came to my mind, because I do a lot of work on succession planning.
Right.
And we've seen that across the board, and the studies have shown that when a business owner doesn't know for certain that there's a succession coming, that they tend to not reinvest in their operation, because like, what am I doing this for? And when they do know that there's a successor, whether it's in the family or not, they're more likely to make longer term investments. One of the examples I give, I work with an orchard down in southeast Vermont, and when it was clear his daughter was coming back, all of a sudden that next year he was putting in thousands of feet of 16-foot high deer fence that needed to be replaced, but he wasn't doing it, and started replanting certain sections that he wasn't doing because he didn't know. And I think the same thing would apply here, for sure.
Yeah.
Do you want to head to the woods and finish
Yeah.
conversation and continue the conversation
Thanks a lot,
there?
Leora.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate the conversation. I'm heading out. I'm going to go in the woods with you, but then I have to leave. But I really enjoyed this opportunity to interact with you.
Thank you for coming in. Great to have you.